Have you ever wondered about the forgotten voices in the Bible? The people who lived in the shadows of the great patriarchs, yet played crucial roles in God's grand design? Today, we're going to explore one such story that will leave you breathless and transform how you see God's compassion for the outcast. Picture this: a young woman, far from her homeland, forced into circumstances beyond her control. She's not a queen or a prophetess. She's simply a servant, overlooked and undervalued. But what happens next will show you that God sees every heart, hears every cry, and has a plan for every life, no matter how forgotten they may seem. This is the story of Hagar, and it's filled with rejection, survival, divine encounters, and promises that would echo through generations. If you think you know her story, prepare to be amazed by details that will change everything you thought you knew. Long before Hagar became a central figure in one of the Bible's most dramatic stories, she was simply an Egyptian servant. But how did she end up in the household of Abraham and Sarah? This detail reveals something profound about God's mysterious ways. Many biblical scholars believe Hagar's journey began during a time of great hardship. When famine struck the land, Abraham and Sarah were forced to seek refuge in Egypt. It was there, in Genesis chapter 12, that Abraham made a decision that would change many lives forever. Fearing for his own safety because of Sarah's extraordinary beauty, Abraham told Pharaoh that Sarah was his sister, not his wife. Pharaoh, thinking Sarah was available, took her into his palace and showered Abraham with gifts in return. These gifts included livestock, wealth, and servants. It was likely during this exchange that Hagar was given to Sarah as a servant. Think about that for a moment. Hagar's entire life was shaped by a decision she had no part in making. She had no say in leaving Egypt, no voice in whom she would serve, and certainly no control over what would happen to her next. She found herself caught between the will of people and the sovereignty of God, completely unaware that she was about to become part of a story that would impact nations for generations to come. Years passed in Abraham's household, and Sarah remained childless. In ancient times, this was not just a personal disappointment but a source of deep shame. A woman's value was often measured by her ability to bear children, and Sarah was growing older with each passing year. Despite God's promise that Abraham would father a great nation, Sarah struggled to believe it would happen through her. Desperation often leads to decisions that seem logical in the moment but carry consequences no one can foresee. Sarah devised a plan that was not uncommon in her culture but would create a storm of emotions and conflict. She approached Abraham with a proposal that would change Hagar's life forever. "The Lord has kept me from having children," Sarah said to Abraham. "Go, sleep with my servant. Perhaps I can build a family through her." These words from Genesis 16 verse 2 seem simple, but they represent a moment of profound consequence. For Hagar, this was not a request or an opportunity. It was a command. In that time and culture, a servant's body belonged to her master. She had no choice in the matter. She was being forced into a situation where she would carry a child, but not for herself. Any son she bore would legally belong to Sarah. But something unexpected happened when Hagar conceived. For the first time in her life, she possessed something that Sarah did not: the ability to bear Abraham's child. This pregnancy elevated her status in a way that no one had anticipated. The Bible tells us that once Hagar became pregnant, she began to despise Sarah. The Hebrew word used here suggests a deep contempt, a looking down upon someone who was once her superior. Perhaps for the first time in her life, Hagar felt important, valued, seen. She was carrying the heir to Abraham's household, and she knew it. This shift in dynamics was not something Sarah was prepared to handle. The woman who had orchestrated this arrangement now found herself facing consequences she hadn't considered. Her servant, the one who was supposed to solve her problem, had become a source of daily humiliation. Sarah's response was swift and harsh. She dealt so cruelly with Hagar that the young pregnant woman made a desperate decision. She ran away into the wilderness, choosing the uncertainty of the desert over the certainty of continued mistreatment. Imagine Hagar's state of mind as she fled. She was pregnant, alone, and had nowhere to go. She was running from the only security she had ever known into a vast, unforgiving wilderness. Her heart must have been pounding with fear and desperation. Had she escaped one form of suffering only to embrace something far worse? It was in this moment of absolute despair that something extraordinary happened. These words, recorded in Genesis 16 verse 8, came from the angel of the Lord, a mysterious figure that many scholars believe represents God Himself. This was not just any messenger. This was a divine encounter, a moment when heaven reached down to touch earth in the most unexpected way. Notice something remarkable here. The angel called her by name. Up until this point in the story, no one had addressed Hagar directly. She had been spoken about, used, and mistreated, but God saw her. He acknowledged her existence, her struggle, and her pain. She was not invisible to Him. Still breathless from fear and exhaustion, Hagar answered honestly, "I am running away from my mistress Sarah." Her response was simple, yet it revealed the depth of her desperation. She had nowhere to go. As an enslaved woman who had fled her household, she had no legal rights, no home, and no protection. Her situation was utterly hopeless. Then came the unexpected command, "Go back to your mistress and submit to her." For many, this instruction might seem cruel. Why would God send Hagar back to the very place she had just escaped? But what followed was a promise so profound that it would change everything. The angel of the Lord declared to Hagar, "I will increase your descendants so much that they will be too numerous to count." This was no ordinary blessing. This was the same kind of promise God had given to Abraham. Until this moment, God's covenant had been exclusive to Abraham's lineage through Sarah. But now, God was extending His blessing to Hagar's unborn child. The angel continued with even more shocking news. "You are now pregnant and you will give birth to a son. You shall name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard your misery." Ishmael, the name means God hears. This was the first recorded instance in the Bible of God personally naming a child before birth. The name itself was a direct testimony to Hagar's suffering and God's response to it. He had not ignored her pain. He had heard every cry, seen every tear. Overwhelmed by this encounter, Hagar did something unprecedented. She gave God a name. She called Him Elroy, which means the God who sees me. Think about the significance of this moment. A servant woman, an outcast, dared to give a name to the Almighty. This was an act of faith and recognition that revealed something profound about God's character. Hagar understood something about God that many had yet to grasp. He was not distant or uncaring. He was not blind to suffering or deaf to the cries of the oppressed. He was a God who sees, a God who hears, a God who cares about the forgotten and the rejected. With renewed strength and divine purpose, Hagar obeyed the Lord's command. She turned back toward the household she had fled, but she was no longer just a servant. She was a woman carrying a divine promise, returning not as a defeated runaway but as the mother of a child whose destiny had already been written by God Himself. Years passed, and Hagar's son Ishmael grew into a strong and lively boy. Though he was not the child of God's covenant with Abraham, he was still Abraham's firstborn and, by all cultural standards, the heir to his father's household. Hagar must have watched him with pride, knowing that God Himself had promised to make Ishmael into a great nation, but everything changed the day Isaac was born. Sarah, who had once been barren and hopeless, now held her long-awaited son in her arms. The miracle child, the fulfillment of God's promise, had finally arrived. With his birth, Hagar's position in the household became dangerously uncertain. At first, everything seemed peaceful. Ishmael, now a teenager, had lived as Abraham's only son for years. But as Isaac grew, a rivalry began to form between the two boys. The tension reached its peak on the day of Isaac's weaning feast, a celebration that marked his transition from infancy to childhood. During the festivities, Sarah witnessed something that made her blood boil. The Bible tells us that Sarah saw that the son whom Hagar the Egyptian had borne to Abraham was mocking. The Hebrew word used here is debated among scholars. Some suggest that Ishmael was simply teasing or playing with Isaac, while others believe it was something more serious, perhaps a challenge to Isaac's position as the heir. Whatever the case, Sarah saw it as a direct threat to her son's future, and she had had enough. She turned to Abraham and made a demand that would shatter the family. Get rid of that slave woman and her son, for that woman's son will never share in the inheritance with my son Isaac. Notice how Sarah no longer even used their names. Hagar and Ishmael were reduced to nothing more than that woman and her son. The dehumanizing language revealed the depth of Sarah's resentment and determination. Abraham was devastated. Ishmael was still his son, flesh of his flesh, and sending him away would be like cutting off a part of himself. But then God spoke to Abraham with words that would seal their fate. Do not be distressed about the boy and your slave woman. Listen to whatever Sarah tells you, because it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned. But I will make the son of the slave into a nation also, because he is your offspring. This was a turning point. Ishmael would not inherit alongside Isaac, but God had not forgotten him or the promise he had made to Hagar in the wilderness. The next morning, Abraham rose early and prepared meager provisions for Hagar and Ishmael, just a skin of water and some bread. Then, with a heavy heart, he sent them away into the wilderness of Beersheba. This moment was devastating. Hagar, who had once walked back into Sarah's household with God's promise in her heart, now walked away for the final time, homeless, abandoned, and completely uncertain of what lay ahead. Ishmael, once the beloved son of Abraham, was now just a wandering outcast. As the mother and son disappeared into the scorching desert, the weight of their rejection settled over them like a suffocating blanket. They had lost everything. Their home, their security, their place in Abraham's family. All they had was each other and a rapidly diminishing supply of water. The scorching sun hung mercilessly in the sky as Hagar and Ishmael wandered through the wilderness. Their provisions were meager, and in the relentless heat, the water ran out far too quickly. Every breath became a desperate struggle for survival. Their journey had turned into a fight for life itself. As the hours passed, Ishmael's strength began to fade. His lips cracked from thirst, his steps grew unsteady, and eventually, his young body could take no more. He collapsed under the weight of exhaustion and dehydration, and Hagar watched helplessly as her son began to die. The situation was hopeless. Hagar could not bear to watch Ishmael's final moments. She had already lost everything: her home, her status, any hope of a secure future. But to watch the child she had carried, nursed, and loved take his last breath was too much to bear. Overcome with sorrow, she placed him under the shade of a small bush, as if to shield him from the final agony of death. Then she walked away, sitting down about a bow shot's distance from him. I cannot watch the boy die, she said, and as she sat there in the sand, she began to sob. Imagine the pain in that moment. A mother, utterly helpless, unable to do anything but weep as her child lay dying. The promise God had given her years before seemed like a cruel joke. Where was the great nation he had spoken of? Where was the God who sees? But what Hagar didn't know was that God had not abandoned them. As her sobs filled the air, another cry reached heaven, the cry of Ishmael. The Bible tells us that God heard the boy crying, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, "What is the matter, Hagar? Do not be afraid. God has heard the boy crying as he lies there." This was a powerful reminder that God had not forgotten them. He had promised to make Ishmael a great nation, and he was not a God who breaks his promises. The angel's words carried both comfort and assurance. Lift the boy up and take him by the hand, for I will make him into a great nation. Hagar, still shaking with grief, looked up through her tears. Then something miraculous happened. The Bible records, "Then God opened her eyes and she saw a well of water. So she went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink." right there, in the middle of the wilderness, a well appeared. Had it been there all along, hidden from her sight by despair and panic? Or had God supernaturally provided it in that moment of desperate need? The text doesn't tell us, but the message was clear. God had always been there. He had seen her when she first ran into the wilderness, and he saw her now. He was still Elroy, the God who sees, and he was still faithful to his promises. Hagar rushed to Ishmael's side, lifting him up and giving him the life-saving water. With every sip, strength returned to his body. Hope returned to his eyes. From that moment, everything changed. Ishmael did not die in the desert. Instead, he grew into a strong warrior, a survivor, the forefather of a great nation, just as God had promised. The Bible tells us that God was with the boy as he grew up. He lived in the wilderness and became an archer. Imagine Ishmael, once a helpless child on the brink of death, now learning to navigate the wild terrain of Paran. He grew strong, hardened by the desert, his very survival a testimony to God's provision and faithfulness. Hagar, once a slave and an outcast, became the matriarch of a people. Her influence on Ishmael must have been profound. She would have told him of Elroy, the God who sees. She would have reminded him of the moment God heard his cry in the wilderness. These experiences shaped Ishmael's identity and faith. He didn't grow up with the privilege of Isaac, but he grew up with something just as powerful: God's promise that he too would become a great nation. Years passed, and Ishmael's descendants multiplied exactly as God had promised. As the Lord had said to Abraham, "As for Ishmael, I have heard you. I will surely bless him. I will make him fruitful and will greatly increase his numbers. He will be the father of 12 rulers, and I will make him into a great nation." And that is exactly what happened. Ishmael became the father of 12 princes, each the leader of his own tribe. His descendants spread throughout the regions of Arabia, becoming powerful and influential. The Ishmaelites, as they were known, became skilled traders and survivors in the harsh desert environment. Generations later, it was Ishmael's descendants, the Midianites, who would buy Joseph from his brothers and sell him into Egypt. This connection shows how the lives of Isaac's and Ishmael's descendants continued to interweave throughout history, sometimes in peace, sometimes in conflict, but always part of God's greater plan. Hagar's story is ultimately one of hope for the rejected and forgotten. She was a woman who had been cast out, seen as nothing more than a servant, a problem to be solved. But God saw her differently. He gave her a future beyond slavery, a purpose beyond servitude, and a legacy that would last for generations. Her name is still remembered today, not just as the mother of Ishmael, but as a woman who encountered God in her lowest moments and lived to see his promises fulfilled. She is a reminder that God sees the forgotten, hears the cries of the desperate, and provides for those who have nowhere else to turn. Hagar's journey shows us that God is faithful to all his promises. To the rejected, he says, "I see you." To the abandoned, he says, "I hear you." To the outcast, he says, "I have a plan for you." No matter where we find ourselves, no matter how forgotten we feel, his mercy meets us in our wilderness. In a world that often overlooks the marginalized and forgotten, Hagar's story reminds us that God's love knows no boundaries. He doesn't just care for the prominent and powerful. He sees the servant in the shadows, hears the cry of the abandoned child, and provides wells of hope in the most unlikely places. The story of Hagar teaches us that God's grace extends to everyone, regardless of their status, background, or circumstances. She was a foreign servant who became the mother of nations, a rejected woman who received divine promises, an outcast who encountered the living God not once but twice. Her journey from slavery to freedom, from rejection to divine favor, from despair to hope, reminds us that God's plans are often hidden in the most unexpected places and revealed through the most unlikely people. He truly is Elroy, the God who sees, and there is no one too forgotten for his love, no one too rejected for his grace. no one too outcast for His mercy. If this story has touched your heart and opened your eyes to God's incredible love for the forgotten, I encourage you to like this video and share it with others who might need to hear this message of hope. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more inspiring biblical stories that bring the scriptures to life in fresh and meaningful ways. What part of Hagar's story resonated most with you? Have you ever felt forgotten or rejected? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear how God has shown Himself to be El Roi, the God who sees, in your own life. Remember, no matter what wilderness you might be walking through today, God sees you, God hears you, and God has a plan for you. Until next time, may you find hope in knowing that you are never forgotten by the One who sees all.